An hour before my brother was supposed to leave my house, my 7-year-old came to me with wide eyes and shaking hands and said her favorite toys were missing. I figured they'd turned up under a couch or in a blanket pile like they always did, until I saw my brother's girlfriend's daughters hunched over a backpack, snapping it shut the second we walked in. I'm 39, and my younger brother, I'll call him Chase, is 32. He's been dating his girlfriend, Vivan, for almost 2 years. She's 35. About a month into their relationship, she got pregnant. Their son is almost 1 now. Vivan also has 2 daughters, both 8, from a previous relationship. They're close in age to my daughter, so whenever Chase and Vivan visited from out of state, the girls would play non-stop. We have a spare room, so they stayed with us often. And until last weekend, everything felt fine. That weekend was no different, until it was time for them to pack up. My daughter noticed a few toys were missing about an hour before they were set to leave. The kids had been playing all weekend, so I didn't jump to conclusions. I told her we'd find them, and we started searching. 20 minutes later, we still hadn't found anything, so I asked Vivan's daughters if they remembered where they'd last played with the toys. They said they didn't remember, but their faces looked guilty. Not "I lost it" guilty, more like "please don't ask me again" guilty. I asked Chase and Vivan if they'd seen them. Chase said he'd seen those exact toys in the room where Vivan's girls had been sleeping. We all went to check. The toys weren't there. Chase asked Vivan if she might have moved them when she was packing the girls' things that morning. She shrugged and said she hadn't seen them. We went back to the living room. That's when I noticed Vivan's daughters sitting together over a backpack. The second they saw us, they yanked it closed like it was on fire. Chase asked them again, more firmly, if they knew where the toys were. This time, they didn't answer at all. They just looked at their mother. Chase reached for the backpack, and Vivan exploded. She started shouting at me. How dare I accuse her daughters of stealing? How disgusting it was. How I was humiliating them. She tried to yank the backpack away like it contained state secrets. Chase opened it anyway. Inside were my daughter's missing toys. Not just those. Several others too. My stomach dropped. Then I got angry. Real angry. Because toys don't accidentally end up zipped inside a bag right before someone leaves. I told Vivan I wanted to know what else was missing. I demanded she open the 2 suitcases they'd packed. She said no. She said it was an invasion of privacy. She tried to grab the suitcases and walk out. Chase stopped her. He told her to open them, and when she did, it got worse. She pulled out clothing that belonged to my daughter, tops, skirts, dresses, and then a pair of brand new Nike sneakers that were unquestionably my child's. Shoes my daughter hadn't misplaced, shoes that weren't even old enough to be confused with anything else. I took everything back. Then I said the words that were already sitting in my throat the moment that backpack opened. Vivan and her daughters were not welcome in my home again. Since then, I've gotten messages from unknown numbers. Vivan using different phones, I guess, telling me I embarrassed her, that I traumatized her girls, that they were promised those items, that I made them cry. Promised. That word mattered, because my daughter didn't promise them her belongings. I didn't promise them my kids' clothes. Chase didn't promise them my kids' shoes. And somehow, Vivan's daughters were acting like they'd been told it was fine to take whatever they wanted. Chase was furious with her, but he also told me I was too harsh and that I should have handled it privately. I felt sick that the girls left crying. I do. I'm not made of stone. But I also couldn't ignore what had happened right in front of me. My child's things were being packed to leave my house, and the only reason we caught it was because my daughter spoke up in time. Later, when I replayed the moment over and over, I couldn't shake the feeling that the girls didn't fully understand what they were doing. They'd looked at their mother like they were waiting for instructions, like they'd been coached, like they'd been told, "It's okay, she said you can." And if that was true, then this wasn't just kids being kids. It was their mother using them. After that weekend, Chase and I talked more seriously. I didn't know who had promised them anything, but I had my guess. Vivan wanted me to go into another room with her, away from Chase and the kids, so she could talk it out. I refused. I wasn't going to be pulled into a private conversation so she could spin the story and make me doubt what I'd seen with my own eyes. And then more information started surfacing, things I wish I'd never had to learn. I reached out to someone who knew Vivon, and once the door cracked open, everything spilled out. She wasn't who she claimed to be. She had used a fake name. She had a criminal history. Details I'm not going to lay out publicly because this is my brother's life and my nephew's future, but it was enough to make Chase go pale. It wasn't just a bad weekend. It was a pattern, a con. And suddenly, that fast pregnancy didn't feel like a sweet surprise anymore. It felt strategic. Within days, Chase and my nephew moved into my house while he started taking steps to cut ties and get legal clarity. He arranged a DNA test, not because he didn't love the baby, but because he needed the truth on paper in case Vivon tried to use that child to control him the way she'd controlled everything else. And it hit me like a punch. If we hadn't caught the theft, if my daughter hadn't noticed, if we'd waved it off like kids misplace stuff, my brother might still be in the dark, still paying, still trapped, still building a future with a woman we didn't actually know. I couldn't press charges for the stolen items because technically nothing had left my home, but the fact that we'd found the items packed and ready to go was all I needed to know. People can call me harsh, but I watched my daughter's things get taken from her own house. I watched a grown woman scream when her kids were caught with stolen property. I watched her try to leave with 2 suitcases full of my child's belongings like it was normal. If protecting my kid and drawing a hard line makes me the villain in Vivon's story, I can live with that. Because the alternative was teaching my daughter that her things don't matter, her voice doesn't matter, and adults can walk into our home, take what they want, and demand we handle it privately so they don't feel embarrassed. No, I didn't embarrass her. She embarrassed herself the moment she tried to walk out with my child's shoes. And the more I thought about it, the more the privacy argument made me furious. Because if it had been a misunderstanding, if it had been innocent, there wouldn't have been screaming. There wouldn't have been grabbing bags and trying to flee. There wouldn't have been that instant panic the moment Chase touched the backpack. Vivon didn't react like a mother shocked her kids had made a mistake. She reacted like someone who'd been caught. After they left, I didn't sleep. I kept going back to the same images. My daughter's face when she realized her toys were gone, the way those 2 girls looked at their mom for permission, the way Vivon tried to rip the backpack out of Chase's hands. The next day, the messages started. Different numbers, same tone. You humiliated us. You traumatized my daughters. They were promised those things. How could you do that in front of everyone? I didn't answer at first. I wanted nothing to do with her. But Chase was still in that messy fog people get in when they've invested years into someone and don't want to believe what's right in front of them. He was angry, yes, but he also sounded conflicted. He told me he couldn't stop thinking about the girls crying. He said maybe we should have handled it differently. He said maybe I shouldn't have banned them so fast. So I laid it out in the simplest terms I could. Chase, your girlfriend tried to leave my house with my daughter's things. Not 1 item, not 2, a whole pile. And she didn't apologize. She screamed. She tried to run. That is not a misunderstanding. He didn't argue with the facts, but I could tell he was still trying to build a bridge where there wasn't one, still trying to believe there was a version of Vivon that made sense. And honestly, I didn't want to be the person forcing him to face reality. I wanted him to get there on his own. But I also wasn't going to sit quietly and let him keep bringing her into my home like nothing happened. So I told him my boundary one more time. He and the baby were welcome anytime. But Vivon and her daughters were not stepping inside my house again. That's when he admitted something that made my skin crawl. Vivon had been complaining for months that my daughter had too much. She'd made comments about my kid having more toys than all 3 of her children combined. She'd said it like it was unfair. Like my child having nice things was some kind of moral failure, and suddenly that word, promised, made sense. Not because I promised anything, but because Vivon might have promised her daughters things she didn't own. And if she'd been comfortable doing that with toys and clothes, what else had she been doing? I needed answers, not for gossip, not for revenge, for safety. Because once a person steals from you in your own home, you start replaying every other moment you brushed off. The little comments, the weird looks, the way she'd hover near my daughter's room, the way she always seemed to know what we had. So I did something I'd never done before. I reached out to someone from Chase's side, someone who knew Vivon before he did. I didn't even have high expectations. I thought I'd hear something boring like, she's dramatic, or she's messy. Instead, what I heard made my stomach twist. Apparently, Vivon wasn't even the name she'd been using before. Not exactly. She told people different versions of her last name. She'd claimed one was her maiden name when it was actually from a previous marriage. And there were legal problems. Real ones. The kind of problems you don't just forget to mention when you move in with a new boyfriend who's paying for everything. The more I listened, the more I realized we didn't know who this woman was at all. And she'd had access to my home, to my child, to my family. That was the moment I stopped worrying about whether I'd been too harsh. Because harsh is yelling at someone who made an honest mistake. What I was dealing with was someone who felt entitled to take from a child, and then make herself the victim when she got caught. I told Chase we needed to talk, privately, without her. No distractions, no excuses. When he came over, he looked exhausted, like he'd been arguing with himself for days. I showed him what I'd learned. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't throw insults. I just laid out the facts and the pattern. And I watched my brother's face change in real time. First denial, then confusion, then a slow, sick realization. He kept saying, I didn't know, like if he repeated it enough, it would undo the last 2 years. I asked him a question that cut through all of it. What if we hadn't caught her? He didn't answer, because we both knew the answer. If we hadn't caught her, Vivon would have kept taking, and she would have taught her daughters it was normal to take from other people as long as you could cry and play victim when someone confronted you. That night, Chase didn't go back to her. He brought the baby and stayed with us, and for the first time since this happened, I felt something other than anger. I felt fear, because it wasn't just my daughter's toys anymore. It was the fact that my brother had built a life with someone we didn't truly know, and now there was a child involved. He told me he was going to get a DNA test, not as a punishment, as protection. Because if Vivon was willing to lie about who she was and steal from a little girl, then he couldn't assume anything was off limits. I didn't celebrate. I didn't say, I told you so. I just told him he wasn't alone, and that we'd keep him and the baby safe while he figured out the legal next steps. And as weird as it sounds, the most heartbreaking part was realizing the 2 little girls might be victims too, because if their mother had told them those things were promised, then they weren't acting out of malice. They were acting out of conditioning, which meant this wasn't going to end with one awkward conversation. This was going to end with Chase choosing between the fantasy he wanted and the reality he was living. For a few days, everything felt suspended in midair. Chase barely slept. He kept replaying moments he'd brushed off before, little arguments, strange stories, gaps that hadn't made sense at the time. Things that had seemed harmless when he was in love now looked constructed. Meanwhile, Vivon's messages escalated. They weren't apologies. They were accusations. She told him I was turning him against her. She said I'd always hated her. She claimed I'd set her up to make her look bad. She insisted her daughters were innocent and that I'd traumatized them for life. At no point did she say, I'm sorry for taking your niece's things. Not once. What she wanted wasn't forgiveness. She wanted control back. Chase didn't respond. He needed space to breathe. And that silence seemed to unhinge her. She started messaging him from new numbers. Then she began reaching out to extended family, people who had nothing to do with what happened, painting herself as a victim of a cruel, judgmental sister-in-law who hated her kids. That's when Chase finally saw it. Not in one dramatic moment, in 1,000 small ones. Every message had the same structure. She was always wronged. Someone else was always cruel. Nothing was ever her responsibility. He told me quietly, she never says she did anything wrong. And that was the sentence that ended it. Because people who make mistakes apologize. People who manipulate rewrite the story. Chase called her that night. I didn't hear the whole conversation, but I heard enough. He asked her directly if she had told the girls the items were promised. She hesitated. Then she said something like, I just didn't want them to feel left out? Not, I was wrong. Not, I shouldn't have done that. Just justification. He told her he needed space, that he couldn't trust her right now, that he and the baby were staying with us until things were clear. She cried, then she raged, then she threatened. She said he was abandoning their family. She said I was poisoning him. She said if he left her, she'd make sure he regretted it. When the call ended, Chase stared at his phone like it had burned him. I don't recognize her anymore, he said, and I told him the truth. You're not seeing someone new, you're seeing who she's always been, just without the mask. The DNA test was scheduled. Lawyers were consulted. He started documenting everything, every message, every threat, every inconsistency. Not because he wanted to destroy her, because he finally understood something crucial. Love doesn't make someone safe, and a child ties you to a person forever. That realization broke him in ways I couldn't fix. But it also saved him. Weeks later, the results came back. The baby was his. He didn't cry. He just nodded. I figured, he said. And then he did something that proved he was finally thinking clearly. He didn't go back to her. He didn't say, well, she's the mother, so I have to. He said, then I have to protect him. Because paternity didn't erase what she'd done. It didn't undo the lies. It didn't make the theft disappear. It didn't make her reaction any less alarming. If anything, it raised the stakes. He began the process of separating legally. Custody, housing, everything. And through all of it, Vivian never once asked about the baby's routine. Never asked what he was eating. Never asked how he was sleeping. She asked about money, about who was paying for what, about whether Chase had turned everyone against her. That told him everything he needed to know. The two little girls stayed with her, and that part still haunts me, because they cried when they left my house, not because they'd been caught, because their world was unstable and they felt it. I don't think they're bad kids. I think they're growing up under someone who teaches them that taking is normal if you frame it right, that you don't apologize, you attack, that you don't admit, you rewrite, and I hate that. But I couldn't save them. I could only save my child and my brother. People still ask me if I regret how I handled it, if I wish I'd been gentler, if I think things might have turned out better if I'd pulled Vivian aside privately and whispered instead of confronting her in front of everyone. And sometimes, late at night, I think about those girls' faces, about how small they looked when everything fell apart, and it hurts. But then I remember something just as clearly. If I had been gentler, if I had been polite, if I had prioritized an adult woman's pride over my daughter's safety, my child would have learned that her voice didn't matter, that adults could take from her, that keeping peace was more important than protecting yourself. And I will never teach her that. So if that makes me the villain in someone else's story, I can live with that, because in my daughter's story, I chose her. In the weeks that followed, the house felt different, quieter, heavier, safer. Chase settled into a rhythm with his son, feeding him in the early mornings, pacing the hallway at night when he wouldn't sleep, learning how to be a single father in real time. It wasn't easy. There were moments he looked hollowed out, like grief and shock were still fighting inside him. But there was also something else. Clarity. Vivian kept trying. New numbers, long messages, voicemails that shifted from sobbing to rage in seconds. Sometimes she begged, sometimes she threatened, sometimes she rewrote the entire story as if none of it had happened, like we'd imagined the toys, like I'd fabricated the scene. Chase saved everything. He stopped engaging, and that, more than anything, enraged her, because people like her don't fear anger. They fear irrelevance. She tried to use the girls to soften him. She sent photos. She wrote about how confused they were, how much they missed him, how unfair it was that he'd abandoned their family. But every message still centered on her pain, never on what she'd done, never on why this was happening, never on the baby's well-being, just her. He finally said something to me that I'll never forget. She doesn't want me, she wants what I provide. And once he saw that, he couldn't unsee it. The legal process moved slowly but steadily. Custody arrangements, financial boundaries, documentation. He learned how much power there is in calm, boring consistency. Meanwhile, my daughter started sleeping better. She stopped double-checking her toy box before bed. She stopped asking if she could keep things safe in my room. She stopped worrying that something she loved might disappear, and that alone told me everything. Because kids don't make those changes unless something inside them relaxes. I never sat her down and explained what had happened in adult terms. I didn't need to. She understood in the way children do. She knew that when her things were taken, I believed her. She knew that when something felt wrong, I didn't tell her to be quiet. She knew that home was a place where she was protected. Chase is still rebuilding. Some days he's strong, some days he's tired in a way sleep doesn't fix. But he is present, he is learning, and he is no longer living inside a story someone else wrote for him. I still think about Vivon's daughters. I hope one day they learn that love doesn't mean taking, that safety doesn't come from manipulation, that you don't have to steal what you're allowed to ask for. But I can't teach them that. I can only teach my child. And I did. I didn't scream first. I didn't accuse without reason. I didn't imagine what I saw. I stood in my own home, looked at stolen things packed to leave, and said, no. And that single word changed everything. Not because it was loud, but because it was final.
That's where the story ends. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think of this story in the comments. Subscribe to the channel and see you next time.